Welcome back for our second class in the Maamar of Beyom Ashtei Asar Yom. And we're going to go right into the meat of the Maamar, starting with chapter 1 of 13 chapters, 13 oisius we call them, 13 numbers. And this, the meat of the discourse always classically begins with a verse from the Torah, and then asks a few questions. And these questions very often are serious questions, but they're also questions which are taking us somewhere. And so the process of a classic Maamar is that we have some questions, and then we are taught some profound ideas. And then once we understand those profound ideas, we understand how these new profound ideas explain to us and answer the original questions. And that's what the Rebbe does in this Maamar. And the reason why he is teaching a Maamar on this verse is because it's talking about the 11th day. Beyom Ashtei Asar is the 11th day. And it's talking about the 11th day of the inauguration of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, when the Jews built the Mishkan, the tabernacle, in the desert. So after it was built, it was erected on the Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day of the month of Nisan, and every day for the first 12 days, a different leader of one of the 12 tribes brought sacrifices in order to inaugurate the temple. The 11th day of the month of Nisan, which is the birthday of the Rebbe, and that is a part of the significance of this particular verse to the day when he said it, was the 11th day of the month of Nisan. 11th day of the month of Nisan, the prince, the leader of the tribe of Asar, brought the sacrifices. And so that's the verse that he begins with. And I'm going to be reading along in the English. And you can see in downloading or the text or buying the actual book, which I have links to under the video, you'll be able to get the Hebrew as well if that's of interest to you. So on the 11th day, the prince of the tribe of Asar, his offering was. That's what the verse says. His offering was. What was his offering? Actually, every single prince brought the exact same offerings as all of the other princes. So he brought, and it lists the different offerings that he brought, which are the exact same offerings as the princes that preceded him and the one that will follow him. So the verse is part of the description of the sacrifices brought by the princes of the tribes of the Jewish people in connection with the dedication of the sanctuary in the desert. The sanctuary was dedicated on the 1st of Nisan. On that day, and on each of the 11 subsequent days, one of the princes of the Jewish people brought sacrificial offerings. On the 11th day, the prince of the tribe of Asar offered his sacrifices. Now, the Medrash states regarding this, so the Medrash explains that although the princes from every tribe each brought the same number and type of animals and articles as an offering, each of the princes had a different motivating rationale for his offering, which reflected the divine service connected with that specific tribe. You may wonder, what is each tribe contributing uniquely if they're all bringing the exact same sacrifices? But we know that when we do something, there is the actual body of what we are doing, the structure, the deed itself, and then there is the emotion, the intent, and the focus behind what we're doing. That is much more personal. Two people do the same mitzvah, but and they're doing the exact same. If you watch them, the body of the mitzvah, if you will, that's a metaphor of just the physical structure of the mitzvah, is the same. But the motivation and intent varies based on the types of people that each person is and the style of their neshama, of their soul, where God designs us all very differently. So that's where the difference was. And Asar contributed something unique, like every tribe did. What was unique about Asar? So the Midrash tells us that all the tribes were given names that reflect the redemption of Israel and her praise. That every one of the tribes were given a name, that the name of the tribe is a name which reflects the idea of redemption and also reflects the idea of her praise. the praise of the Jewish people. Asher was named for the sake of the redemption of Israel, as it's written, all the nations shall praise you. It says V'ishru. You see here the name Asher. That word V'ishru, which means to praise, is the root of that word is Asher. It's really the same word. V'ishru eschem kol hagoyim. Kiti atem eretz chayfetz amar Hashem tzvakos. That all the nations shall praise you, and you will be a land of desire, says God, commander of legions. So we see that the name Asher is associated with the idea that all of the nations of the world are going to praise the Jewish people once Mashiach comes. During the Messianic era, when everyone's going to see the reality of God, and they're going to be able to see that the Jewish people have a unique place in this world as God's chosen people to fulfill a particular mission, they're going to praise us. So Asher represents this idea of redemption because we are going to be praised during the time of redemption by the other nations. So this praise is associated with redemption because it is only in the era of the redemption that the nations will wholeheartedly praise the Jewish people. And Asher was named for Israel's praise. We said the Midrash says there are two themes that every name of the tribes carries, both a theme of redemption and a theme of praise for the Jewish people. So Asher also carries the name of Israel's praise, as it's written, Ashrei ha'am shekacha alai, Ashrei ha'am sh'Hashem aleikav. You may be familiar with this verse because it's in Ashrei, which in Ashrei, the Ashrei prayer, which we say 3 times a day, is actually from Tehillim, the book of Tehillim. And the word Ashrei is fortunate. Fortunate is the nation whose lot is this. Fortunate is the nation whose God is the Lord. So we see that the name Asher expresses the praise of the Jewish people, that we are fortunate people because we are God's people. So Ashrei, fortunate, in Hebrew shares the same root letters again as the name Asher. So Asher is similar to Ashrei, fortunate. Asher is similar to V'ishru, which means they will praise. So Israel's good fortune rests solely on her choice of the Holy One. Blessed be He to be her God. So what gives the Jewish people good fortune? What makes us fortunate? What makes us fortunate is the fact that God chose us to be His people. It's not something that we earned. It's not something that we deserve credit for. It's something that was given to us. God chose us. And God's choice of her to be His cherished nation. Therefore, when the praise of Asher came to offer, when the prince of Asher came to offer his sacrifices, he offered those sacrifices in recognition of God's choice of Israel over all the nations. When he brought the sacrifices, what was he thinking? What was on his mind? What was on his mind was what was a unique meditation, if you will, or thought in his mind. And that is the recognition that God chose the Jewish people over all the nations. That we were chosen. As it is written, and God has chosen you this day to be His cherished people. As the verse says, Uvacha bachar Hashem alekecha liya Yisrael li'am segula. That Hashem, as the Torah writes this, that Hashem chose us to be His cherished people. The passage requires explanation, though. And here we're going to jump into a complex idea, a complex philosophical idea, and we're going to do our best to understand it as best as we can. And if you're struggling with the idea, that's fantastic. Think about the idea. Let this idea stick with you through the day, through the week, and repeatedly come back to it to think it through. So this passage requires explanation. Initially, the Medrash states that the good fortune of Israel is that they chose and continue to choose the Holy One, blessed be He. So the Medrash first says that the good fortune of Israel is a nation who chose God, and we continue to choose God. In other words, the at the very end of the Medrash, it says I'm going back. Israel's good fortune rests solely on her choice of the Holy One, blessed be He, to be her God. that why are we called fortunate? We are fortunate because we have the good fortune that we chose God. So the focus is on the Jewish people choosing God. Though the Medrash continues by saying that God chose the Jewish people, that appears to be mentioned as a secondary point. And then it says, and also, we're fortunate because God chose us. So when we follow the sequence of the Medrash, it first focuses on the fact that we are fortunate that we chose God. And then secondly, it says, and we're fortunate that God chose us. This is also reflected in the proof text used to illustrate this point. Fortunate is the nation whose God is the Lord. Ashrei ha'am shekachalo. That means fortunate are the people who have God as their God, meaning that we chose God. So we even see from the text that the Medrash uses to bring out its point, the focus is us choosing God. This is comparable to the Jews' choice of the Holy One, blessed be He, to be their God. Afterwards, however, the Medrash states that the sacrifice of the tribe of Asher, that the sacrifices that they brought on that day, that the tribe of Asher brought, who was so named because of Israel's good fortune, was brought because the Holy One, blessed be He, chose Israel. When it repeats itself, and this is what the tribe of Asher had in mind when it brought the sacrifices, what did it have in mind? The Medrash says the second point and doesn't say the first point. That God chose the Jewish people and not that we are fortunate that we chose God. It's thus necessary to understand why the focus was switched from the Jewish people's choice of God to God's choice of the Jewish people. Now you may think to yourself, I don't lose sleep over such questions. In fact, I generally don't even have such questions. When I read, if I would have read the Medrash and no one would have said anything to me, maybe I would never have thought of this question. But clearly, once you analyze the text, it's a clear question. But it's a question that maybe doesn't bother someone. This is the reason why it's significant for us to be given the opportunity to have this question and to go through the Maamar and begin to realize that these nuances carry such profundity that it's worthwhile to go through the entire discourse just to be able to appreciate that every nuance in the Torah and every nuance in the Medrash is teaching us something very profound, most often more profound than we can understand, unless we have the gift of a great Rebbe and teacher teaching us the teachings as we're learning now. It's also necessary to understand why the term choice is used. And here's the complex idea that I made a reference to earlier, which is going to be a little bit challenging. The term choice is relevant when one chooses between two equal entities or between two entities whereby each possess an advantage the other lacks. If one entity is clearly preferable over the other, it's not appropriate to say that the preferable entity is chosen. On the contrary, one is forced, as it were, to select it because of its superiority. Doing otherwise would not make sense. The term choice is appropriate only when there is no reason compelling one to choose one article over the other. Let me explain. You see, we use the word choice in society very, very loosely. Whenever there are two things in front of us and we're choosing one over the other, we say, I chose. But when we think about this, and because we use the word choosing so loosely, it makes it difficult for us to actually understand the true meaning of choice. If you go to a grocery and you're picking out apples, and there's a spoiled apple and there's a fresh apple, your choice has been made for you. You don't need to exercise from within yourself the power or the energy of choice, the effort of choice. The choice has been made. You're not going to buy a spoiled apple. You came to buy something that's edible. So you don't need to exercise choice. It is obvious. And that's the point that the Maamar and Chassidic in general emphasizes when it comes to choice. The true expression of choice happens when we have two things which are precisely equal. And that would be, for example, I'm not going to use apples because arguably one can say that apples are never precisely the same. And the truth is there's probably nothing in the world that's precisely the same, but certain things, at least in our realm of experience, surely do seem to be very much the same. So we're going to use the example of two cars. You go to buy cars, and you tell them you want a certain model, fully loaded, whatever it is, and you want a blue car, right? They take you to the lot and they show you that they have 3 blue cars, fully loaded, the exact model you have. You ask them what's the difference between one and the other. They say they're all exactly the same. You get to choose whichever one you want. So now you think to yourself, which one should I take? I have no idea. Why should I take this one over that one? They're all exactly the same. That is the moment that in fact you are choosing. Because there is nothing else within you that is driving you to one over the other. So when there is an intellectual reason why to choose one over the other, so then your intellect is driving you to one over the other. When is it truly a power of pure choice? Which choice ultimately is in some respect arbitrary, because there is nothing compelling for one over the other. That's when a person uses real, true, genuine choice. This is an idea that you need to think about, especially because for years and years and years, you've probably, like everyone else, have been using the word choice loosely, and we say choice for anything we are picking, but really it's our intellect or our desire that's compelling us to one thing over another. I like vanilla ice cream over chocolate, so I take the vanilla. That's why I take the vanilla. It wasn't a choice. It was my desire and my like that takes me toward that one over that one. But when there's absolutely nothing compelling me, that's when a person is making pure, unadulterated choice. So, why then is the term choice used to describe Israel's choice of the Holy One, blessed be He, over false gods? If this is the definition of choice, can we say that the Jewish people chose God over other gods, over idols, over other deities, false gods? One is real, one is false. It's not, you don't need to make a choice. Again, if you have 2 identical things, you need to make a choice. If you don't have 2 identical things, then you don't need to make a choice. One is obviously more valuable than the other. So obviously there's no comparison between the two. A similar question applies regarding God's choice of Israel. And here we're going to get into something even deeper. Since Israel is incomparably superior to all other nations, and that needs to be understood, and we can understand that if you've studied Tanya. But this is not a statement of elitism. It's a statement of God giving us a superior strength spiritually so that we can live up to our responsibility of 613 commandments. So how can it be said that the Holy One, blessed be He, chose Israel? If we have in fact been given a superior spiritual strength, then it's not a choice to choose the Jewish people over another nation. So Tanya states that the phrase, "and you chose us from all nations and tongues," refers to the body, which in its physical form appears to resemble the bodies of the nations. It is inappropriate to use the term choice regarding the souls of the Jewish people because the Jews' souls are obviously higher, as I just explained. The body of a Jew, however, resembles that of a non-Jew, and hence, in that context, the term choice is relevant. And that's why the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya that when it speaks of choice, it's speaking about God's choice of the body of the Jewish people. But explanation is also required here. And again, this all requires some background from the first chapter of Tanya, which I'm not going to dwell on a lot right now because this is not the primary focus of the Maamar. It's just a question leading up to the focus of the Maamar. So seemingly, the fact that the bodies of the Jewish people resemble the bodies of the non-Jews externally does not sufficiently explain why the term choice is used regarding God's choice of the Jewish people. There is a fundamental difference between the bodies of the Jewish people and the bodies of non-Jews. There's a big difference between the bodies of the Jewish people and the bodies of the non-Jews as well, in their spiritual state, in their spiritual energy, which is what the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya. So the source of the life force of a Jewish body is klipas noiga. the source of the existence of permissible substances whose godly spark can be revealed in a direct manner by utilizing them for a holy purpose. I'll explain this in just a moment. The source of the life force of a body of a non-Jew is the three impure klipos, the source of those substances whose godly spark cannot be revealed in an ordinary manner. Now, for a person on the physical plane, it is appropriate to say that the selection of one body over the other stems from choice because we as humans are not capable of distinguishing between the spiritual makeup of different bodies. God, however, obviously appreciates this distinction. God's the creator of it. God obviously knows the distinction. Why then is his selection of the Jewish people termed choice? One would think that the positive quality even their bodies inherently possess would necessitate their selection. So I'm not going to thoroughly explain as I said I would, but let's just understand that the spiritual makeup of a Jewish body and of a Gentile body is a little bit different. And it's different, and even though we don't necessarily recognize that difference, God surely recognizes the difference. And if God recognizes the difference, then God doesn't need to exercise the power of choice to choose the Jewish people over the Gentile nations, because they're different. And when there's a difference between two things, you're not using choice. You're making a calculated decision. Choice is only when things are equal. So these are the questions that the Maamar begins with. And these are really a prelude to the ideas that we're going to begin to learn. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to jump to chapter 2 as a short chapter, so we're going to include chapter 2 in this class as well. So the above can be understood by prefacing with an explanation of the verse, Chelki Havaya Amra Nafshi. We can understand this through the explanation of the verse that King David writes in Psalms. I'm sorry, you'll excuse me, but this verse actually is from the book of Lamentations of Eicha, written by the prophet Jeremiah. Chelki Havaya Amra Nafshi. That God is my portion, says my soul. On this verse, the Medrash on the book of Eicha comments that to illustrate with an analogy, and this you may remember from the introduction, a king entered a country accompanied by dukes, prefects, and commanders. One person said, I will choose a duke as my patron. Another said, I will choose a prefect as my patron. And still another said, I will choose a commander as my patron. They wanted to attach themselves to one of the officers so that he would be their benefactor. There was a clever person among them who said, I will choose the king. Ana nasiv malka. I will choose the king, because the others are all subject to replacement, while the king is not subject to replacement. King is the boss. No one can fire the boss. But everyone else is an employee, they can all be fired, so to speak. And we're going to pay attention again to the nuances, because the details are going to be significant as we proceed in the Maamar, and he asks some questions about this medrash too, which will lead us into a deep understanding of what selflessness means and what we should be striving for in our lives. In the analog, there are Gentile nations. So then the medrash, what is the analog? What do we learn from this analogy, from this story? That there are Gentile nations who serve the sun and others who serve the moon. Israel, by contrast, serves only the Holy One, blessed be He. This is the intent of the verse, Chelki Havaya Amra Nafshi. That my soul is saying that my portion is God, that I'm here to serve God. I'm not here to serve any of the prefects or the commanders or the other officers. That is the role of the Jewish people. Now, there are well-known explanations regarding the details of the Medrash. For on the surface, its intent requires explanation. Everyone, even one who is not clever, even a very young child, knows that the king is greater than the duke or the other officers. Why then would cleverness be required to choose the king? Now you may already know this from our introduction. But now we're learning through the details. We're going to learn some more details here. You don't need cleverness to choose the king. Obviously, the king is greater than his officers. He's higher than them. Also, the rationale given for choosing the king requires explanation. Another surprising thing is when the Medrash says that they chose the king, the clever one chose the king over all the other officers. What's the reason he said that? What's the reason the Medrash says that that the clever one chose the king? Because the clever one is not replaceable, and all the other ones are replaceable. And if the king was replaceable, isn't he still? Although that would be in some way fundamentally flawed, but isn't he still, by nature of being the king, greater than his officers? This is the question, and he'll elaborate on this so we can understand it even better. Even if the position of the duke and other officers would be permanent, and they would not be subject to replacement, they had a lifetime contract, they couldn't be fired. It is obvious that the king is greater than they. It's obvious that the king is greater. And this is certainly true according to the well-known explanation of the verse, which is written in the book of Shmuel, when it speaks about our first king, the first Jewish king, King Shaul. It describes him, when it describes his greatness, it says, Mishichmai v'mayla gavoya mikolam. He was from shoulders and above higher than all the other people. What does that mean? So it means different things on different levels. But on a character level, a stature level, it means the verse refers to King Shaul, the first of Israel's kings. The spiritual implications, however, apply to all proper monarchs. That all proper monarchs have this same same superiority, if you will, of Mishichmai v'mayla gavoya mikolam. They possess inner qualities that are inherently loftier than those of their subjects. Implied is that the king's shoulders, what do the shoulders imply? His emotions that are drawn down from the intellect in his head, and which influence his lower levels, are higher than the heads, the intellect of the people at large. It's saying that the shoulders are above a person's head. So the shoulders represent a person's emotions, and how those emotions drive the entire body of a person. King Shaul was so great, so much greater than the average person, that his emotions were higher than the average person's intellect. That's how strong his emotions were directed by his own intellect. So the king's inherent superiority places him in a different category than the entire nation. The main point is, we see that kings are inherently greater than the people. So if that is the case, the reason why the clever one would choose the king is because the king is inherently greater. Not because the king is not replaceable and the officers are replaceable. Because even if his officers would not be replaceable, the king is inherently greater. This includes even the nation's most elevated officers, including the dukes, prefects, and commanders. Why then is it necessary to state the rationale that all the officers are subject to replacement? So why in fact does the Medrash say that the reason why the clever one chooses the king over the officers is because the king is not replaceable? Seemingly, the king should be chosen in any case because of his superior qualities. So, we discussed, in brief summary, the verse of the story of Asar, and that Asar, the name, like all the names of the tribes, are an expression of expression of redemption and an expression of praise to the Jewish people. As the verse says, fortunate are we that we have chosen God. And we ask the question that why in fact then does the Medrash refer to, then speak of God choosing us, when the Medrash first speaks of and focuses on the Jewish people choosing God? And why is choice used regardless of the Jewish people choosing God? We don't need to exercise the power of choice, because choice is a unique quality of a human being that they exercise only when we don't have any other part of our conscious self that can decide for us what we would like one over the other. When we cannot choose one over the other because two things are very equal, or there's a trade-off which makes them in ultimate value equal, so then we have to use the power of choice. But if God is completely, obviously, infinitely greater than any other of these false gods, we don't need to exercise choice to choose God, and God doesn't need to exercise choice to choose us. If God, in fact, gave the Jewish people a unique spirit, both in our soul and in our body. So, in order to understand this, the Rebbe introduced us to a verse from the Book of Lamentations. Chelki Havai Amra Nafshi, that a Jewish soul says, "My portion is God," and he tells us about the Medrash and the king and his and his officers, and how the other nations choose the officers, which represents the suns and the moon and all of the other powers that God created that they choose to serve. And the Jewish people say, "Ana Nosiv Malka, I choose the king," that we choose God. And the reason why the clever one chooses God is because the clever one chooses the king, is because the king is not replaceable, officers are replaceable. So on this, the Rebbe asks two questions. First of all, you don't need to be clever to choose the king. Anyone can see that the king is greater than his officers. So why does the Medrash emphasize the point that the clever one chooses the king? And number two, why does the Medrash throw in a reason, which seems to be a secondary reason, that the reason why the clever one chooses the king is because he's irreplaceable? We know that a king is inherently head and shoulders above another person. And so if you just look at the king and you look at his officers, you know to choose the king, because his quality is far, far greater. So why does the Medrash focus on the idea that the clever one chose the king? Because the king is irreplaceable. And with this, we'll continue with chapter 3 in our next class.